はい。それでは時間になりましたので、2022年6月10日、ロングチャペルを、開催いたします。まずはじめに、前奏の時を持っていきたいと思います。心を静めて、共に神様に心を向けます、向けましょう。それでは賛美歌326番、新生賛美歌の326番、ガリラヤの風、共に賛美していきましょう。よいしょ、お待ちください。それでは、本日の聖書箇所をお読みいたします。本日与えられている聖書箇所は、サムエル記上17章49節です。サムエル記上17章49節です。聖書訳は、教会共同訳になっております。それでは、司会者がお読みいたします。ダビデは袋に手を入れて石を取り出すと、石投げ紐を使って ペリシテ人めがけて飛ばし、その額を打った。石はペリシテ人の額に食い込み、彼はうつ伏せに倒れた。アメン。それでは司会者がお祈りさせていただきます。皆さんも共に心を合わせてお祈りをしていきましょう。ご在天主なる私たちの神様、あなたの皆を今晩も褒めたたえることができることに心から感謝いたします。それぞれの地域から、それぞれの生活の中から、私たちがあなたのために、またこのオンライン上に集まり、あなたを賛美することができる、この喜びに感謝いたします。今日は特別にロングチャペルとして、ジョナサン・マゴネット先生がロンドンからわざわざ私たちのために講演をなさってくださいます。語られる講演の中で私たちに知らなかったものを気づかせてくださり、もう一度あなたのこの計画が何であるかを私たちそれぞれ分からしめてくださいますように心からお祈りします。どうぞ語られるジョナサン・マゴネット先生の上にあなたが力を授けてくださいますように、どうぞ大胆に、私たちに講演を通して語ってくださいますように心からお祈りいたします。ここに参加されたすべての一人一人がこの講演を通して、このロングチャペルを通して、また一つあなたのことが分かることのできる、そういう有意義な機会とさせてください。一切のことをあなたに委ねます。この祈りを主イエス・キリストの皆によってお祈りいたします。アメン。それでは、講師の紹介の後に、マゴネット先生に、ゴリアトに不公平、よく知られた聖書物語の再読と題して、講演をしていただきます。その前にですね、講師紹介として浜野先生、浜野道夫進学部長によって、講師紹介をお願いいたします。それでは、お願いします。
はい、皆さんよく集まってくださいまして、お忙しい中ありがとうございます。今年もこうして、マゴネット先生をお迎えして、講演会を開くことが、1年ぶりですね、することができて感謝いたします。もうコロナでろくなことがない2年間でしたけど、でもこうしてズームをみんな使うことができて、ロンドンからでもお話を聞けることを本当に嬉しく思っております。マグネット先生は毎年直接セーナーに来てくださっていたんですけれども、コロナのことがあって、それでもこうやってズームでお話を聞けております。1942年にロンドンでお生まれになり、お医者さんとして働いていらっしゃったんですけれども、25歳でリオベックカレッジに入学されて、1971年にラビーですね、ユダヤ教の教師に任職されていらっしゃいます。そしてヘブライ大学ですね、イスラエルの、そして、ドイツのハイデルベルク大学で学び、博士号を取得していらっしゃいます。1974年より母校のレオベックカレッジで教鞭を取り、1985年から2005年まで学長も務めていらっしゃいます。ヨーロッパあるいはイスラエルで、各都市で客員教授を歴任なさいまして、本当にイスラム教、ユダヤ教、キリスト教の大切な対話の時ともに同じ聖書の神を祈り求める時をアレンジしてきてくださり、また語ってきてくださり、私自身大変多くのことを学ばされております。改革派ユダヤ教を代表する学者として、世界的に有名な先生でいらっしゃいます。セイナン学院では2014年に名誉博士号を、取得していただいて、おります。今日もまた楽しみに来ました。私自身しておりました、ラビの教えを通して、ヘブライ語聖書を読んでいく、その中に キリスト教はそもそも何だったのかということをより深く知ることができる、そういう経験を今までも私自身させていただいてきました。今日も楽しみにしております。去年は前期に2回連続した講演会だったんですけれども、今年は後期に学術研究所の主催の講演会があって、今年ももう1回あります。ただそれは後期の方ですね。また案内します。そこでは今本当に祈りの課題です。戦争が続いております。そのことについて先生から伺うことができると聞いておりますので、そのことも楽しみにしております。はい、それではどうぞ、マゴネット先生、ドクター・マゴネット、please begin your lecture, please.
Should I begin?
Yes, please,
Okay.
please.
So, 皆さんこんばんは。本恋の文章を翻訳してくださった日原先生に感謝申し上げます。Unfair to Goliath, rereading a familiar Bible story. The story of the fatal encounter between the young David and the giant Philistine champion Goliath is one of the most famous and popular in the Hebrew Bible. It is taught approvingly to children, how a young David confronts a huge opponent and with a simple child's slingshot defeats him. It is evoked in innumerable situations where the weak somehow overcome the strong. Individuals fighting against mega corporations, heroic defenders beating off an invading army, victims of crime getting justice against their powerful exploiters. It is popular in religious traditions, where David's trust and faith in God can be praised and recommended as a guarantee of success. Nevertheless, because of its universalism and popularity, the imagery also lends itself to parodies and caricature, where a symbolic Goliath inevitably squashes his small opponent. But how David's success comes about, according to the details of the Hebrew narrative in the first book of Samuel, chapter 17, suggests that a number of factors need to be taken into account. According to the biblical record, the Israelite tribes had settled in the land of Canaan, whether by immediate conquest or by gradual settlement. Their greatest enemy amongst the various states that occupied the region were the Philistines, a people who had settled on the southern coastal plain from about 1200 BCE. It was the threat from the Philistines in particular that led the Israelites to change their society from a loosely allied collection of tribal-linked families into a centrally organized state led by a king. As they expressed it, to govern us like all the nations. One of the primary tasks of a king was defense of the realm. The first appointed king was Saul, who had initial military successes. According to the biblical record, David was a successful soldier and initially a military ally of Saul. However, in time, Saul's jealousy and David's ambition led to a split between them. The story of David and Goliath is introduced as one of two versions about how David and Saul first met. It is recounted in 1 Samuel chapter 17. It is a long chapter and frequently switches between different perspectives on the same events. This can make it confusing to follow as a narrative. Since we are attuned to experiencing stories visually in the cinema or on television, it may be helpful to transfer the verses into the way in which they might be shown as if in a movie. There are 26 separate scenes, which can be laid out in a storyboard, indicating a variety of different camera techniques that might be employed. Long shots, panoramic views, crowd scenes, foreground, dialogues, close-ups, perhaps even slow motion and freeze frame with the fall and death of Goliath. I apologize for the quality of my drawings, but I hope that the attached illustration shows how the story might be visualized. So the storyboard. Scene 1, verses 1 to 3. A panoramic shot of two armies encamped on facing hillsides with a valley between them. Perhaps the sun is reflected off the armor of one side, marking the superior weapons of the Philistines. Scene 2, verses 4 to 10. Close up on Goliath stepping out from the Philistine ranks with his shield bearer, standing in the valley, challenging the Israelites to single combat. Scene 3. The scene switches to King Saul with his generals at the head of his army, apparently helpless to respond. Scene 4, verses 12 to 15. A voiceover introduces David as the youngest son of Jesse, with scenes showing him guarding the sheep, then visiting the battlefront with provisions for his brothers. Scene 5, verse 16. Repeated shots of Goliath's emergence day after day to taunt the Israelites. Scene 6, verses 17 to 18. Close up as Jesse instructs David to bring provisions to his brothers, check their welfare, and bring gifts to their commanding officers, presumably to help protect them. Scene 7. Close up of David's brothers as the camera pulls back to a crane shot, revealing Saul's poorly equipped army on the hillside. Scene 8, verse 20. A tracking shot follows David leaving someone in charge of the sheep while he journeys to the encampment and then down to the battlefront where the soldiers are shouting their war cries. Scene 9. Repeat of scene 1, the two armies encamped on opposing hillsides. Scene 10. The handheld camera follows David as he deposits the provisions and goes to meet his brothers. As they talk, a long shot shows Goliath coming out and repeating his daily challenge. A close-up on David shows his reaction. Scene 11, verse 24. A long shot, the men of Israel at the battlefront see Goliath and retreat in fear. Scene 12, verses 25 to 27. The camera moves through the crowd of Israelite soldiers talking among themselves, with David listening intently. They are saying that whoever kills Goliath, the king will reward with riches and the hand of his daughter in marriage. David speaks aloud his anger. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine who defies the armies of the living God? Scene 13, verses 28 to 29. Close up. An angry Eliab, David's oldest brother, accuses David of abandoning the sheep just to come to see the battle. David, close up, clearly upset about being accused unfairly, and reverts to an old childish response to his brothers. What have I done now? It was only a word. Scene 14, verse 30 to 31. Crowd scene. David turns to others, repeating his anger at the behavior of Goliath. Others respond, and the word about David carries till someone brings it to King Saul. Scene 15, verses 32 to 37. Saul's tent. Present are David, Saul, and Abner, Saul's commander-in-chief. David offers to fight Goliath. Saul, you are too young. He is a man of war. David tells how he has protected his sheep from lions and bears. There is a pause. Saul seems unconvinced. David adds, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the Philistines." This religious argument persuades Saul. "Go," he says, "and the Lord be with you." Scene 16, verses 38 to 39, a comic interlude. Saul gives David his helmet and coat of mail and sword, but David is constrained by them, can hardly move, and takes them off. Scene 17, verse 40. In the valley, camera follows in great detail as David takes his staff, chooses 5 smooth stones from the stream, conceals them in his shepherd's bag, takes his sling in his hand, and approaches the Philistine. Scene 18, verses 41 to 44. A long shot showing the contrast in size as Goliath moves towards David. Then the camera looks over Goliath's shoulders as he sees David's youth and beauty, despises him for coming to fight with only sticks, and curses him. "I will give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." Scene 19, verses 45 to 47. David's perspective as he shouts defiantly at Goliath. "You come with the sword and spear and javelin. I come in the name of the Lord. The Lord will deliver you into my hands. I will strike you down and cut off your head. This day I will deliver the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals. It is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you all into our hands." Scene 20, verse 48. Long shot of Goliath beginning to march slowly towards David. Soundtrack emphasizes the tread of his feet. David runs towards him. Scene 21, verses 49 to 51a. David selects a pebble from his bag, arms his slingshot, and hurls the pebble, which strikes the Philistine in the forehead. The stone sinks in, and, slow motion, the great body falls forward on his face. Voiceover. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David runs to the Philistine, takes his sword, kills him, and cuts off his head with the sword. Scene 22, verse 51b. Middle shot of the Philistine army watching in dismay, then panic and run away. Scene 23, verses 52 to 53. Tracking shot follows the Philistines with the Israelites in pursuit. Camera pulls back to look down on the Philistines fleeing towards their distant cities of Gat and Ekron, then pulls back to see the Israelites plundering the Philistine camp. Scene 24, which is not on your picture, I'm afraid, but scene 24, verse 54, flash forward. David takes the head of Goliath to Jerusalem and Goliath's weapons to his tent. So back to scene 25, verses 55 to 56. Close up, conversation, Saul and Abner. Saul, who is this young man? Abner, I don't know. Saul, ask whose son he is. Scene 26, verses 57 to 58. Abner brings David to Saul with the head of Goliath. Saul asks, whose son are you? David says, the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. Fade to black, cut. So that is the screen. That's how it would appear if it was a film. Now to the narrative itself. Let us now examine some of the details in the chapter. When Goliath appears, he is described as Ish HaBeinayim, literally a man of the space between the two armies, a representative champion or challenger who is chosen to undertake single combat on behalf of his army against a similar warrior from the other side. Goliath's words are not mere boasting or provocation, but an invitation to a specific military duel. Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us. This practice was familiar in parts of the Near East at the time, with the contest between two warring factions determined by the victory or defeat of their respective champion. It would also have the advantage of replacing a full-scale battle between the armies. Although this was apparently a familiar way of waging war to the Philistines, with Goliath a well-trained and tested champion, it seems that the Israelites at that stage did not have people prepared for such combat. As the text points out, Saul and the Israelites were dismayed and very frightened. The detailed description of Goliath's armor underscores his military training and the awesome power he represented. At this time, the Philistines were a well-organized fighting force. They used chariots, and their infantry was equipped with weapons of a high standard. Moreover, they maintained control of the local area to their military advantage. As the Bible records a few chapters earlier, in 1 Samuel chapter 13, now there was no smith found throughout all the land of Israel. For the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make themselves swords or spears. But every one of the Israelites went down to the Philistines to sharpen his plowshare, his mattock, his axe, or his sickle. So it came to pass in the day of battle that there was neither sword nor spear found in the hand of any of the people that were with Saul and Jonathan. Only with Saul and Jonathan his son were they to be found. In the imagined cinema version, the camera would pan slowly down the body of Goliath, from the helmet of bronze on his head, over the bronze coat of mail, down to the greaves of bronze protecting his lower legs. The Bible even notes the enormous weight of his protective coat as 5,000 shekels of bronze, about 100 weight, a terrifying fighting machine. Having introduced Goliath, our story now introduces David. We are given his family background in detail. His father is Jesse from Bethlehem in Judah, who has 8 sons. The 3 oldest are named, and we learn that they have joined Saul's army, while David, the youngest, is guarding the sheep of his father. This detailed introduction seems to suggest that we have no previous knowledge of David. But much of the same information is actually given in 2 stories in the previous chapter. This raises questions about the actual sequence of events, which we will examine later. David has been sent by his father to bring provisions to his brothers. For the first time, he is present when Goliath makes his challenge. It seems that David does not react immediately because we first learn about a promise that is being passed around by the Israelites. Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. There is no direct evidence that this is truly a proclamation by the king or a mere rumor, but it is what immediately triggers David's angry response. What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? David's words suggest that two elements play a part in his reaction. One is clearly his feeling that not only his own people have been insulted by the words of Goliath, but also Israel's God. But the other factor is the promise of a reward about which David inquires when he begins to speak to those around him. That this latter aspect is important to David is reinforced in the following sentence, when the people take David's question seriously and respond, "So shall it be done to the man who kills him." So David's defiant words are enclosed within the repeated suggestion about a possible reward. The narrator seems to have introduced a hint here of the ambition that may also be a driving force in David's rise to power. In time, Michal, Saul's younger daughter, will fall in love with David, though the narrator never states that David loves her in return. She will marry David, but in doing so, she becomes, perhaps unknowingly, a pawn in King Saul's response to his growing fear about the success of David. She defies her father and saves David's life. Later, Saul will marry her to Palti ben Laish. But even after Saul's death, she is used as a factor in the negotiations to unite Saul's and David's kingdoms. Her bitterness at her experience is revealed in their final estrangement, when she pours scorn on David at the time of his greatest success, bringing the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, his new capital city. If David's defiant words indicate a vision of a wider world that has opened up before him, the immediately following scene throws him back into his childhood role and experience as the youngest of 8 brothers. In an almost comic juxtaposition, Eliab, his eldest brother, angrily tells him off, as if David is a naughty boy, neglecting his duties just to watch the soldiers fight. "Why have you come down? With whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle." David is lost for words, reduced from his heroic protests against Goliath's arrogant insult to a kind of childlike reaction to the bullying of his older brother. "What have I done now? It was only a word." But David repeats his heartfelt criticism of Goliath, and the word circulates until it reaches King Saul. When David is presented to Saul, any possibility of success against Goliath seems highly unlikely. Both Saul and Goliath refer to David as a na'ar, usually translated as youth. In these two cases, as a dismissive term. But the word is used, for example, of Jonathan's sword bearer, clearly an adult and important military role. David describes how he protected his sheep from lions and bears. Presumably his staff, which he will take into the battle with Goliath, must have played a role when it came to close contact engagement. But he also had the slingshot as a weapon, if only to drive marauding animals away. Whether Saul is convinced by David's self-confidence, or his obvious trust in the support of God, or because it is a final desperate attempt to respond to the way Goliath's daily challenge is wearing down the courage of his troops, Saul allows David to face Goliath. But clearly affected by the conventions of the duel, Saul insists that David wear his own armor, giving him some sort of defense against Goliath. But David finds himself totally hampered by its weight and inconvenience. We should remember that David is considered relatively small in stature and Saul has been introduced to the reader as the tallest person in the country. David's helplessness adds an unexpected comic touch to the narrative richness of the chapter. Perhaps this experience with the armor, combined with our previous information about the weight of Goliath's armor, helped define the essence of David's tactics. While upright, Goliath is a massive killing machine. But if he can be brought down to the ground, the weight alone would make him helpless to defend himself. But how to achieve this? David's first ploy is to conceal the stones he has chosen as his weapon of choice, so that all Goliath can see is David's staff. In fact, this apparent choice of weapon infuriates Goliath, so that he dismisses it and calls out, "Am I a dog that you counter me with sticks?" Presumably, their swapping of insults and battle cries gives David enough time to get close to Goliath before taking a stone out of his bag and arming the sling. The conventional translations of what follows contain three serious problems. Firstly, the stone hits Goliath el mitzcho, in his forehead. The noun metzach translates literally as brow or forehead. The problem with the translation in the context of Goliath is that we have already been told that Goliath has a helmet. So how could David negotiate a stone into a protected part of the head? Secondly, perhaps more seriously, the next sentence says that the stone sank down in his metzach. If it refers to his forehead as a description, it makes little sense, though it has led to interesting medical speculations. Perhaps Goliath's giant size meant that he suffered from a hormonal condition called acromegaly, where the bones grew extra large, but may perhaps be softer, so the stone could sink down. But even if we could justify this suggestion, it would not explain the third element, why a blow to the front of his head made Goliath fall face down and not backwards. Why a blow to the front of his head made Goliath fall face down and not backwards. I presume that it is possible to evoke a miracle to explain how this could happen, but fortunately, it is not necessary. If we return to the description of Goliath's armor, we will encounter the identical word that occurs only here in the Hebrew Bible, in the description of the armor that protected Goliath's lower legs, the greaves. In order for Goliath to be able to bend his knees and walk, the greaves could only come to a height just above his knees. Those who have watched English cricket will be familiar with the cricket pads that fulfill the same protective function of the lower legs of the cricket players. The Hebrew word used here has the same letters as the word for forehead, with an added letter to make up the grammatical construct form mitzchat nechoshet, greaves of bronze. This proposed link was made by Ariella Diem in an article in Vetus Testamentum some years ago. On this reading, the stone would have struck Goliath just above one of the greaves, would have sunk down behind it, making him stumble and fall forward on his face. Once down, David had time to take Goliath's sword and kill him with it. All this is a tribute to David's strategic thinking, but it may not be sufficient to justify the title Unfair to Goliath. However, there is another dimension that needs to be addressed, and that has to do with the conduct of war in general. In his book, The Art of Warfare in Biblical Lands, Yigal Yadin, a professor of archaeology at the Hebrew University, and himself chief of staff of the Israeli forces at the time of Israel's War of Independence in 1948, analyzes military issues. I quote, "There is a reciprocal impact on nations who come into conflict with each other. There are similar reciprocal influences, inevitable and consistent, which the different weapons, fortifications, tactics, and military organizations make upon each other. The study of military development is in large measure the study of the unending process of reaction of each element in warfare to its counterpart. The development of weapons must be studied against the background of the development of tactics, army structure, and the systems of fortifications. But account must also be taken of a human feature which has affected the rate of military development among different people, inertia or conservatism." Yadin gives as an example the invention of chain mail to deflect an arrow. But this in turn led to the development of more powerful bows, which in turn necessitated stronger kinds of armor. In the case of David and Goliath, we see an example of the problem of inertia or conservatism. Goliath was totally reliant on a particular tradition of the duel between champions, equally matched in their weaponry and defenses, slugging it out in the field. Here, instead, he was confronted by an agile, mobile opponent with a secret weapon. The slingshot was a favored and well-attested military weapon. It had the advantage over arrows that it could fly at greater speed and far further, not impeded by the drag imposed by feathers. As to accuracy, the book of Judges records that the tribe of Benjamin could field 700 select men who were left-handed. Each one could sling a stone at a hair's breadth and not miss. Allowing for a degree of exaggeration, a skilled operator could throw with great accuracy. As to the power of the stone slung in this way, experiments have demonstrated that the speed and force of a stone from a slingshot was equal to that of a bullet from a handgun. As a shepherd, David would certainly have honed his skills. Given the advantage of this recognition of the one weak spot in Goliath's armor, poor Goliath did not have a chance. Although the story of David's triumph over Goliath is a central topic of this chapter, the narrative about David does not end there. Already the two closing verses of the chapter raise questions that may lead us to reevaluate a couple of earlier texts that we have examined. Verses 55 to 58, when Saul saw David go forth against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is this youth?" And Abner said, "As your soul lives, O king, I do not know." The king said, "Go personally and ask whose son the young man is." When David returned from fighting the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. Saul said to him, "Whose son are you, young man?" David said, "The son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite." So I want to look at the wider context of this story. When we first meet David in chapter 17, he is introduced as follows. Now David was the son of an Ephratite of Bethlehem in Judah, named Jesse, who had 8 sons. In the days of Saul, the man was already old, well advanced in years. The 3 eldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul to the battle, and the names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, and next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 eldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. You have noted before that this detailed introduction suggests that we have no previous knowledge of David, but much of the same information is actually given in two stories in the previous chapter, which raises questions about the editing of these chapters. In the book of Samuel, we learn how the Israelites had been led by Samuel, acting as a priest, a prophet, and political leader. But as he grew older, the people felt the need to introduce a king who would lead them in their wars with other local states. Though Samuel was opposed, God agreed and told Samuel to anoint as king a young man from the tribe of Benjamin who had come to visit him. The very next day, Samuel met a tall, handsome young man who came to him and immediately assumed that he was to become the king, and God consented. However, partly because of his disapproval of the change of leadership, Samuel came into conflict with Saul, effectively undermining him in various ways. Things came to a head, and following their final split, God instructs Samuel to anoint Saul's successor. So in chapter 16, immediately preceding the episode with Goliath, Samuel undertakes a secret journey to the home of Jesse in Bethlehem to anoint one of his sons as Saul's successor. We are introduced to Jesse and his first three sons by name. Samuel sees in the eldest son, Eliab, the same kind of physical stature that led him to choose Saul. So God has to intervene quickly before Samuel can speak and remind the prophet that the qualities God is seeking are not based on those outward appearances. In fact, Samuel is reproached for relying on his personal opinion rather than awaiting the divine word. I quote from Samuel 16:7, Do not look to his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as a man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. Having viewed the other sons of Jesse who are rejected, David is finally brought from where he has been guarding the sheep. And when Samuel hesitates, God tells him, Arise and anoint him, for this is he. Presumably, the secret of David's anointing is kept in the family until the time is right for him to emerge. However, in terms of the continuity between these two chapters, this would cast a light on Eliab's angry outburst against David. David's dramatic attack on Goliath would put David in the public eye, which could prove dangerous to him and the family. Hence David's insistence that he has not given away any family secret in the words that he said. In the second part of chapter 16, David's family connection with Jesse is again mentioned, but in a very different context. Now the text deals directly with Saul and the mental disturbances that overwhelm him at times. In biblical terms, we are told that an evil spirit from God torments Saul. His advisors recommend that the soothing effect of music played on a lyre might help, and one of them recommends none other than David, who is described in powerful and significant language. Saul said to his servants, Provide for me a man who can play well and bring him to me. One of the young men answered, Behold, I have seen the son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, who is skilled in playing, a man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, and a man of good presence. And the Lord is with him. Therefore Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, Send me David your son, who is with the sheep. The list of attributes of David seem to belong to a totally different biography. Robert Alter suggests that the military credentials attributed to David here may have been an edited edition to explain the military skills David will display in the following chapter. However, in the context, it may be that the key quality listed here, apart from his musical skills, is that he is prudent in speech, someone who can be relied on to keep the secret of Saul's illness so that it does not become known more widely. Moreover, the listing of military skills could just as well be added for the same reason, to reassure Saul that David will be under orders not to tell. However, if people already know of David's anointing, a more sinister explanation would be that the best way to deal with a potential threat is to keep the person close and under careful observation. If there is any continuity between the two stories in chapter 16, Saul's invitation to Jesse to send David to him must have been a terrifying moment. Surely it means that the secret anointing, which would have amounted to treason against the king, has been found out. Jesse has no choice but to send David to play to the king. The result is an anticlimax. David came to Saul and entered his service, and Saul loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. And Saul sent to Jesse, saying, "Let David remain in my service, for he has found favor in my sight." And whenever the evil spirit from God was upon Saul, David took the lyre and played it with his hand. So Saul was refreshed and was well, and the evil spirit departed from him. And yet, despite all the background in this chapter, chapter 16, when David appears before Saul and offers to kill Goliath, Saul does not appear to know him. The end of chapter 17 actually emphasizes that neither Saul nor Abner seem to know who David is, despite having invited him to perform before Saul. Robert Alter points out that the attempts to harmonize the two narratives of how David first met Saul are unconvincing. For example, by assuming that Saul is affected by amnesia because of his medical condition, and Abner simply goes along with him. Alter suggests that the prevalent scholarly views that chapters 16 and 17 represent two different traditions about David's beginnings are persuasive. He concludes that the redactor, the final editor, preserved both versions despite their inconsistency because of the useful double perspective they give on David. If that is the case, there may nevertheless be evidence of attempts to link the two versions. For example, we have noted that Eliab's anger with David may reflect his fear that David might expose the secret from chapter 16, that David has been anointed by the prophet Samuel, and bring harm to the family. But Eliab may be angry because although the firstborn, he has been passed over for his youngest brother. There is also a sentence that explains that David's brothers were in Saul's army, but, quote, David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. Apart from bringing provisions to his brothers on the battlefield, this might relate to David being summoned from time to play music for Saul. Our conclusion. In terms of popular appeal, it is David's defeat of Goliath that stands out. But it also hints at the tactical and strategic, military and political skills that will stand David in good stead throughout his career. During the early years on the run from Saul, leading a band of other outcasts from society. During his time exiled in the land of the Philistines while conducting secret campaigns against them. While uniting and holding together the two kingdoms after the death of Saul. When fighting battles of survival for the sake of the nation and wars of conquest as he built a small empire. Perhaps above all, he showed his resourcefulness by his skillful recovery after being forced to abandon Jerusalem by the rebellion of his son Absalom. This is the outer legendary David displayed in the book of Samuel. But the same book also gives us the inner man, the ambitions that drive him, the tragedies of his family life, the ever-present tension between the public demands as king and the private needs of the man. But the same young man who defended the honor of his God in the face of the insults of Goliath will struggle with that same God throughout his life. In this chapter, already fully formed, young David takes his first step onto the world stage. No wonder, despite all his apparent advantages, Goliath had little chance against him. As Ariella Deem concluded in her article, to the legendary image of Achilles' heel, we should add Goliath's knee. Arigatou gozaimashita.
それでは、応答の賛美歌を歌いたいと思います。新生賛美歌73番、良き力に我囲まれです。少々お待ちください。すいません。それでは、主の祈りをもって、ロングチャペルの、一部を終了させていただきます。それでは、主の祈り、天に増します我らの父 よ、願わくは皆をあがめさせたまえ。御国をきたらせたまえ。御心の天になるごとく、地にもなさせたまえ。我らの日常の糧を今日も与えたまえ。我らに罪を犯す者を我らが許すごとく、我らの罪をも許したまえ。我らを試みに合わせず、悪より救い出したまえ。国と力と栄えとは限りなく汝のものなればなり。アメン。はい。以上が、本日のロングチャペルの、第1部となっております。続いて第2部の、質疑応答の時間を、持ちたいと思いますけれども、どうでしょうか。これは私の進行でしょうかね。それでも、そうです。はい、わかりました。それでは、本日の、ジョナサン・マゴネット先生に、もう一度、もう一度っていうか、拍手を、送りたいと思います。ありがとうございます。
どうぞ。
はい。それではですね、質疑応答の時を持ちたいと思います。今日いただいた講演の中で何か、質問ある方は挙手のボタンや、あるいは手を挙げていただいても構いませんので、お示しください。どうぞ、いかがでしょうか。ちなみに、質問の、通訳者は、私の進学部の、教授の先生である、須藤一郎先生にお願いしていただきます。よろしくお願いします。はい。何かいかがありますか？何かいかがでしょうか？
ちょっといいでしょうか。
はい。お願いします。すみません。今、ミュートがかかっているんですけれども、ミュートを解除してお願いします。
解除しました。
はい、ありがとうございます。
聞こえますか？
はい、聞こえます。
May I ask you, Jonathan, a small question?
Please.
At page 5,
Mhm.
this is concerning about David's ambition.
Mm.
You remember at page 5, there's a sentence, like I'll read it. The narrator, almost at the middle of the page, the narrator seems to have introduced a hint here of the ambition that may also be a driving force in David's rise to power. Could you explain it more in detail? I mean, ambition, I'm very interested in the word ambition. I have had no idea Davids have such strong ambition. So could you please explain it to us?
Okay. Do you want to say that in Japanese for the audience first, and I'll then answer in English?
そうですね。Okay, then先ほど、ジョナサン・マゴネット先生がお話しされた英文の5ページの中ほどにあるんですけども、デイビッド中ほどにですね、そのダビデの権力を維持する上において、非常に主のこの活力というか、彼をこの先へ進める力ともなっているアンビションっていう言葉を使われているんですけど、そのアンビションというのはどの程度のものなのかちょっと関心があったもんですからお尋ねしたいんですけど、 デビデにおいて、はい、
野心ですね。
野心というのがどの程度のものとして捉えていいのか、これ非常に力強い一つの彼の動機として考えていいのか、それともそこはそこまでの言及はないというふうに考えていいのかという質問なんですけど。
Okay, shall I, if I can respond? Throughout the book of Samuel, the narrator introduces information about David's motivations, but without actually necessarily spelling it out. It hints at what is happening with him. We should translate sentence by sentence. I think
Yes,
Sudo Sensei
yes.
will translate. Yeah.
Thank you. サムエル記ではですね、このナレーター、物語手は、ダビデのそのモチベーションについてですね、ダビデの動機について、情報を与えています。しかしそれは完全に全てを語り尽くすということではなくて、ほのめかしてるんですね。ヒントを与えているということです。
It's the nature of the quality of the writing that allows one to see between the lines the way in which David is behaving sometimes.
じゃあ、あまりそれを力強く解釈する必要はないわけですね。一つのほのめかしとしてという意味ですか？
Please wait a while. I will translate. で、これはですね、その書き方の、その質の問題になります。で、行間を読ませるような書き方をしているってことなんですね。
はいはい。わかりました。
Okay. I'm trying to think of examples to explain this, but very generally, in this particular story, we have shown David's religious loyalty to God and his feeling of anger that the Philistine can be attacking his God. But at the same time, the information that the person who does something against Goliath will be rewarded by marrying the king's daughter is repeated around David's words, so that it's just reminding us that he's also a real human being, and it's not just he's not just a hero without any internal life.
はい。例えばですね、この箇所では、一つは、ダビデのこの宗教的な敬虔さというのが描かれています。ですから、そのゴリアテが主なる神をあざけったのに対して、ダビデは怒るわけですよね。で、しかし、他方でですね、ダビデのこの、個人的なこの目論見って言ったらいいんですかね、もし倒したらどういう褒美がもらえますかということがですね、テキストの中では2回枠のようにですね、囲むように同じ内容が出てくるんですよね。ですからこの部分ではこのダビデの人間的なありさまが描かれていると思います。単なるなんか理想的な英雄だというだけではないということなんですね。
はい、ありがとうございました。
Okay, good. Another question, please. もう質問がありますか？
はい、他にいかがでしょうか、皆様。はい、手が挙がりました。松藤さんですね。よろしくお願いします。
しくお願いします。すいません。絵コンテの入った、とても、わかりやすく楽しい、お話をありがとうございます。質問はですね、子供たちとお話しするときに、最後のゴリアトの首を切るシーンっていうのが非常に印象的で、ゴリアトの首を切るっていう、その首切りっていうのは、その当時の戦いの中で行われていたのかなっていうことが一つと、もう一つはですね、そのなんかこう、最新兵器のようないろんな、意味合いの強いゴリアトの鎧とか槍とかっていうものを後にダビデが、サウルとの関わりの中で逃げたときにゴリアトの剣を自分が手に取って戦いに出ていくっていうシーンは何か意味があるのかなっていうのを聞きたかったんですけど、通訳お願いしてよろしいでしょうか。はい。
はい。At first, thank you very much for your storyboard. I tell this story before children, and the last scene was cutting the head of Goliath. That is really impressive, but I wonder how is that was that really so? Was that the custom of that time? Really cutting down the head, and one another thing. Goliath's armor and weapons, David took them, and later David had those weapons during his wandering and encounter against Saul. Is there any special meaning about this?
Thank you. Two very interesting questions. There's a number of instances already recorded in the Bible of cutting off the head of somebody and often displaying it publicly as a proof that they are killed. It's and a sign of victory. It's not a nice thing to do, but it is part of the practice in warfare at the time. So.
はい、2つの大変興味深い質問ありがとうございます。まず最初の方なんですけれども、聖書自体の中にこの首を切り落とすと、そしてそれを公衆にさらすということが何箇所も出てきます。でそれがその勝利の印っていうことになるんですよね。はい。
I presume you don't tell that bit of the story when you're talking to children.
そうですね。私は子供にこの話を話すときはその部分はちょっとしない方がいいかなと思います。
The second thing, the only piece of Goliath's weaponry that we know about afterwards is his sword, which David did actually obtain.
でゴリアテが持っていたいろんなものでダビデがその後持っていたって分かっているのはその剣だけです。
When David for the first time has to flee from Saul, he has no weapons. So he goes to a place called Nob and meets the priest of Nob, because there Goliath's sword was being stored.
でダビデが最初にサウルの元から逃げた時には何も武器を持っていなかったんですね。でそれで彼はノブっていうところに行きます。でどうしてかっていうとそのノブの祭司が このゴリアテの剣を保管してたからなんですね。
There are tragic consequences to this because when Saul learns that the priest has given him that sword, he assumes that the priest is a traitor to the king, and therefore Saul arranges for the killing of all of the priests of Nob.
で、このことはですね、悲劇的な事柄につながってしまいます。サウルはこの祭司たちがですね、ダビデにゴリアテの剣を渡したということを聞くと、この連中は自分に反乱を起こそうとしているというふうに疑って、でこのノブの祭司たちをみんな皆殺しにしちゃうんですね。
There's a rabbinic reading about this, which is interesting. When Saul was told to kill the Amalekites, he spared the life of the king and didn't do so. And the rabbi said, when he should be cruel, he was kind. And when he should be kind, he was cruel. Saul did not have the right judgment about how to behave in such situations.
このことについては、ラビの面白い読み方があります。サウルはアマレク人たちを殺すように言われたとき、その王の命を助けて殺しませんでした。そこでラビは言います。彼は残酷であるように言われたときに親切だった。そして親切であるべきときに残酷だった。サウルはそのような状況においてどう振る舞うべきか正しい判断力を持っていなかったのだと。
ありがとうございました。子どもたちはですね、割とここで剣が出てきたときに、あれ、ゴリアテは槍しか持ってなかったはずなのになぜか剣が出てきたということで、ゴリアテは剣を持っていたじゃないか、隠し持ってたな、ずるいっていうような、だから負けたんだみたいなことを言ってる子たちもいます。ちょっと面白い箇所だなと本当に思わされました。ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. Children say, so at this point of the story, Goliath, David had the sword of Goliath, but children ask, why sword? Goliath had a spear, not sword. And is it that perhaps so? Goliath has his sword in hidden place or so, so very cunning, and from that reason, Goliath was defeated. That was children's thinking about it.
Yeah, well, children are much more bloodthirsty than we like to think.
子供たちっていうのはちょっと私たちが考えているよりも血が流れるシーンっていうのを喜んじゃってるかもしれません。はい。
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
はい、ありがとうございます。あと、そうですね、1名ほどでしょうかね。はい。はい。石橋先生が手を挙げてくださいました。よろしくお願いします。
マゴネット先生、ありがとうございます。久しぶりにまた先生のお話聞けて嬉しかったです。で、今回のタイトルですね、ゴリアテに不公平というタイトルなんですけども、普通に考えたらダビデの方が圧倒的に不利で不公平と思える物語がでも実はゴリアテの方に不公平だったんじゃないかというそういう趣旨だと理解したんですけれども、すいません、ちょっと私の理解力不足で結論としてどこがゴリア 当に不公平だったのかがいまいちわからなかったので、そこだけもう一度教えていただけるとありがたいです。よろしくお願いします。
Your title of today's talk was Unfair to Goliath. And I think normally we think so. It is unfair to David. But your title reads Unfair to Goliath. So what was unfair to Goliath?
Okay. The assumption is that Goliath was the one who had all of the power to defeat David. And therefore, it was a total surprise that he would be defeated, and by such simple things as a stone and a slingshot. But if you examine the relative use of weapons between Goliath and David, it is clear, especially from the result, that David actually had the better weapons. That Goliath was defeated because he was fighting the wrong battle. I'm afraid that when I was asked to speak here at this time, someone suggested I should talk about the situation in Ukraine and Russia and warfare. And the analogy is very, very powerful, that for the Russians coming with tanks, and is exactly what Goliath was. He was a walking tank. But those same tanks have been destroyed by handheld rocket-guided missiles, which is exactly what David did to Goliath. So it's a scary kind of analogy, but it's very interesting that Goliath didn't have a chance. And therefore, although it wasn't fair to him in the end, when it's because his total expectations of winning were totally destroyed by a different kind of weaponry. And as Galiadin said, armies change and fight against each other, and every new weapon requires a new defense, and so on. And Goliath didn't have a chance because he was fighting the wrong fight against a different kind of enemy.
はい。私が考えたのはですね、ここでゴリアテは、一見そのダビデを打ち破るための、あらゆる力を持っていたと思われるわけですけれども、全く驚くべきことに、とてもシンプルなこの石投げ機、その滑らかな小石でもって倒されてしまうわけですよね。で、結果として見れば、この武器の選択、そして使い方という意味で、ダビデの方がより良い武器を持っていて使ったってことなんですよね。で、ゴリアテはその誤った戦いを戦ってしまっていると、そういうことなんですね。で、最初、今回のこのお話をいただいたときは、ウクライナとロシアの戦争のことに触れてほしいというふうに要請を受けたんですね。で、実はこれは今日のそのダビデとゴリアテのお話の、とってもいい類比になってしまっていると思います。で、ロシアは戦車をたくさん投入して攻めてきたわけですけれども、 ゴリアテっていうのはもう歩く戦車なんですよね。だけども、この戦車が手で持ってるですね、ミサイルで破壊されちゃってる今ですね。もうまるでダビデが石でゴリアテを倒してるみたいですね。で、そうですね。イガエル・ヤディンっていうね、将軍でもあったし、考古学者、聖書学者としても優れた人でもあったんですけど、そのヤディンが言ってるのは、新しい武器が出てきたならば、新しい戦い方が求められていくっていうようなことを言ってるんですよね。で、それで言えば、ゴリアテは、その新しい武器に対処する術がなかったってことなんですよね。そういう意味で、アンフェアっていうタイトルにしたということだと思います。
はい。よろしいでしょうかね。はい。すみません。もう少し、もっと時間を取りたいのは本当に、あるんですけれども、時間がですね、来てしまったので、質疑応答の時間はここまでとしたいと思います。はい。それでは、最後に、報告の時間を持ちたいと思います。そうですね。私からの報告以外にも何か、進学部の方々、報告がある方はいらっしゃいますか？はい。ないようですので、はい、ありがとうございます。私からの報告としましては、来週の月曜日にまたチャペルがありますので、今回はまた斉藤千鶴子先生がチャペルを説教をしてくださるそうなので、またご参加ください。これはすみません。進学部の方々へのお知らせでした。今日来てくださった外部の方々も本当に心から歓迎いたします。本当にご参加くださりありがとうございました。また、本当にすみません。何度もしつこいかもしれませんけれども、もう一度ですね、本当に講演と質疑応答してくださった、ジョナサン・マーゴネット先生と、その通訳者の方である、須藤一郎先生に、感謝の拍手を出したいと思います。
日原先生の翻訳の。
そうです。もちろん、すみま
ん。
せん。本当に、日原先生もこの主催者であります。ありがとうございました。はい。それでは、何もなければ、本日のロングチャペルをここで締めさせたいと思います。どうぞ、はい、ありがとうございました。ご参加くださりありがとうございます。じゃあ、これでミーティングは終了させていただきますので、はい、ありがとうございました。どうぞご自由に退席されてください。